Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On this week's episode, we're telling the story of Arlis Perry, a 19-year-old newlywed who was murdered inside the Stanford Memorial Church in Stanford, California. This case has since been solved as of 2021, but it took over 44 years before DNA finally solved what was a very mysterious murder. Let's begin. Arlis Perry grew up in Bismarck, North Dakota, and was the youngest of 3 children. She was in cheerleading in high school and loved to bake cakes for her teammates as well as the basketball players. While attending school, she met her future husband, Bruce Perry. After graduation, Arlis and Bruce got married in the summer of 1974 and would move right after their wedding to Stanford University in California, where Bruce was registered as a pre-med student and Arlis got a job as a receptionist at a local law firm. Arlis's parents were admittedly not thrilled with the wedding because they thought they were too young to get married, being that they just graduated high school. But Arlis insisted that they were in love and promised to visit their family often. Sadly, 6 short weeks later, she was found dead. By all accounts, Bruce and Arlis were basically the perfect little couple. They were very wholesome, didn't get into trouble, and were proud of their faith. Bruce was known to be a bookwormy type and had set local records for track and field when he was still in high school. After their marriage and moving to California, Arlis started to feel a bit lonely. She found it was hard for her to make new friends in California, and California was so much different than North Dakota, so it was just hard to get used to. She ended up spending a lot of her time taking walks around campus, and she became a frequent visitor to the Stanford Memorial Church, which was also conveniently within walking distance to their home. On October 12, 1974, Bruce and Arlis took an evening walk around campus, and around 11:30 p.m., they'd end their walk by going to the mailbox. While on their way to the mailbox, they had a small argument. Basically, it was something about the tire pressure on the car and who should be responsible to fill the air in the tires. And this seemingly small argument led to Arlis needing some time alone. We've all been there. Sometimes small arguments get more heated than we intend to for whatever reason. And Arlis was stressed out. She was lonely, so this little argument was probably just too much for her at the moment. Being that she was religious and got comfort in her church, she decided that she wanted to go pray inside the church, but without Bruce. So Bruce and her parted ways, and he walked home alone. After some time, Bruce became quite worried because Arlis was taking a really long time to come home from church. This was before cell phones, so all he could do was just wait patiently. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around and she still hadn't returned home from church, he then reported Arlis missing to the Stanford Police Department. Prior to calling police, Bruce did walk around and look for Arlis and thought perhaps that she fell asleep inside while praying, but the church doors were closed and locked. The police investigated the church and found that all the outer doors were locked and assumed Arlis had left already. They questioned some people lingering nearby who informed the police that they did in fact see someone of Arlis's description enter the church and sit down to pray at the very front row. As the group were leaving, they also noted a young man enter the church with sandy blonde hair just after midnight. Police couldn't find the sandy-haired man outside anywhere, and the group also wasn't really sure what happened after they left. Stephen Crawford, a security guard and former police officer, was on duty that night and said that the church closes at midnight, which was just minutes after Arlis was seen by the witnesses. Stephen was actually running late that night and locked the doors closer to 2:10 a.m. He went on to say that he didn't notice the eyewitnesses, Arlis, or the sandy-haired man. He claims the church was completely empty, so he locked it up. Crawford also claims to have made his rounds through the campus at 2 a.m., as his job required him to make visits through the church as well. But again, he didn't notice anything unusual. Bruce was worried that Arlis might have been accidentally locked inside, but police told Bruce to just wait at home in case Arlis returned, and they thought it was unlikely that she was still there. At 5:40 a.m., when Crawford did his final sweep of the church, he noticed that the side door was opened and seemed to have been busted, which he didn't notice earlier. He entered the church through the broken side door, but he didn't notice that anything of value was stolen and assumed it was bored kids who had broken the door. While walking through the church, he also found Arlis's body and called police at 5:45 a.m., October 13th. Arlis would be found near the altar at the front of the church where eyewitnesses had seen her kneel down to pray. She was found face up, arms folded across her chest, and an ice pick was sticking out of the back of her head. The ice pick handle was also broken off and missing. She appeared to have been strangled. She was beaten, and she was naked from the waist down with a 3-foot candle from the church in her vagina and another one between her breasts. Strangely, her jeans were also folded in a diamond shape and placed on her legs as well. Investigators also found some semen on a kneeling pillow near Arlis's body. The police immediately went to Bruce Perry's house to report the discovery, and they were surprised to see that Bruce was covered in blood when he answered the door. The police wanted to arrest him right there on the spot, thinking that he was the person responsible for his wife's death. But Bruce was actually covered in his own blood. He informed the police that he gets chronic nosebleeds when he's stressed out, and this was obviously a very stressful time for him. This nosebleed was obviously alarming, and while this did make police initially suspect Bruce, they must have realized he was telling the truth. To be sure, though, he would go to the station to take a polygraph test, and he passed with no issues. They also compared his handprint to a partial handprint from the candles, but he was not a match. Just to cover their bases, they also compared the partial handprint to Stephen Crawford, the security guard, but it wasn't a match to him either. I should point out that there is a myth that fingerprints can be 100% accurate. They're not. Experts can easily make errors in reading prints, and I would think a partial handprint, the chances of an error would be significantly higher. During the investigation, police had discovered that the broken side door was actually busted from the inside, which meant that Arlis and her attacker must have been trapped inside the church after the door was locked at 12:10. Stephen Crawford also later admitted that he didn't go into the church at 2 a.m. to do his usual walkthrough and only entered at 5 a.m., so Arlis was alone with her attacker for hours. When the police had checked the church at 3 a.m., they didn't go inside either. And at that point, the door wasn't broken. So poor Arlis was presumably being tortured by her attacker from about midnight until past 3 a.m. Police didn't have much to go on, and after clearing Bruce, the only other thing they suspected was that perhaps it was a cult or some satanic ritual. Strangely, just 2 weeks after Arlis was laid to rest, her temporary grave marker was stolen from the cemetery in North Dakota. So perhaps her killer had followed her to California from North Dakota, where she grew up. In the 70s, cults seemed to be more prevalent. Just 5 years earlier, the Manson family had gone through California, and at some point, son of Sam, David Berkowitz, who is a very well-known serial killer from New York, also suggested it was a cult responsible for Arlis Perry. Now, David Berkowitz, if you don't know who he is, he's a serial killer from New York who had originally said his neighbor, Sam Carr, had a black lab that instructed David to kill. Later, David Berkowitz changed his story, saying he was part of a satanic cult along with his neighbor's son, John, and Michael Carr. John Carr was found shot to death just 6 months after David Berkowitz's arrest in North Dakota. And remember, Arlis Perry was from Bismarck, North Dakota. John was apparently the leader of this cult, according to David, and this cult wasn't just the 3 men. It was actually others as well, and allegedly they were traveling across the country, killing to bring chaos to the world. A deputy sheriff in North Dakota, where John Carr was shot, got a package from David Berkowitz, which included a book called The Anatomy of Witchcraft. In that book was Arlis Perry's name. It also had, quote, hunted, stalked, and slain, end quote, written in the margins of the book. There was also, quote, followed to California and Stanford University, end quote, written inside as well. There was speculation that perhaps there was an active cult in Bismarck, North Dakota, and Arlis was followed to California. Other than this book that David Berkowitz sent police, the police really couldn't find evidence of a cult. Then in 1981, Berkowitz sent a letter saying he had more information about Arlis Perry's death. Apparently, he had overheard someone admit to killing her during a cult meeting. Investigators tried to visit Berkowitz in prison to get the name of this individual, but Berkowitz never ended up revealing who it was because he didn't want to be a snitch. Police then thought that Berkowitz was just trying to get attention, and he actually had no idea who it was. After that, the case remained unsolved for almost 40 years. The only other lead they had was the sandy-haired man from the original eyewitnesses who got away. Stephen Crawford, the security guard, was also loosely one of the suspects, but cold case investigators weren't able to gather enough evidence to truly pin the murder on Crawford. Stephen Crawford was arrested in April of 1992 for unrelated charges of theft after an anonymous tip came in. He apparently had stolen hundreds of objects from the Stanford University campus when he was employed as a security guard. Crawford had quit that job at Stanford a few years after the murder and apparently held some sort of grudge against the school. In retaliation, he had been stealing items which were quite valuable. He took American Indian artifacts like sculptures, a totem pole, whale bones, swords, and about 200 rare books. After his arrest, he was released on a $25,000 bail. After he got out of prison, he lived alone in an apartment in California, living off either income assistance or retirement money. His landlord said he mainly kept to himself and generally seemed like a nice person. Finally, in 2018, Arlis Perry's case was solved thanks to DNA. While the case seemed unsolvable, most of the evidence kept leading investigators back to Stephen Crawford, but DNA wasn't a thing back in the 70s. DNA investigators reopened cold cases from time to time and were again looking into Arlis Perry's murder as they wanted to find out if they could find matches after all these years. Stephen was also brought back in for another interview. Finally, by the end of June 2018, DNA evidence became conclusive enough to obtain a search warrant into Stephen Crawford's apartment. On June 28, 2018, officers knocked on the door of Crawford's apartment, informing him of the warrant and to look around. Some reports say police made verbal contact through the closed front door, and when they entered, they saw what they believed was Crawford holding a gun. So they would back off, but a short time later, they heard a gunshot. Other reports say that after the police identified themselves at the door, they entered and found Crawford had shot himself while on the bed. Either way, Stephen Crawford had committed suicide by shooting himself in the head and would be pronounced dead at the scene. Police weren't able to talk to Stephen Crawford now, obviously, but they still searched his apartment and they would find a suicide note that Crawford had written after an interrogation 2 years prior. So it seems as though Crawford knew this day was going to come and had pre-written this note in case he had to suddenly end his life. Investigators were also able to link his DNA thoroughly and confirmed it was in fact Stephen Crawford's DNA, and he was most likely the killer. Now, Stephen Crawford was angry at the university, so police would speculate that Arlis was killed just by chance and not specifically targeted. There was no mention of anything related to any cults being found in the apartment, so perhaps the John Carr shooting in North Dakota wasn't related and David Berkowitz was just playing games with the police. My thoughts? While it's nice that this case is finally closed, it didn't give much closure to Arlis's family. Her father had passed away 4 months prior to knowing that it was Stephen Crawford, and her mother was just really disappointed that it took so long. Her daughter, who was kind, a newlywed who loved church, was just taken far too soon. My heart goes out to Bruce as well, since he lost his wife at such a young age to something so horrific. That's it for today. I'd love to know what you guys think. Thanks again for joining me here, and hit subscribe to support my channel. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.